Mark, episode
Yes.
8.
Isn't 8 like a baker's dozen? I meant like a small baker. Right? We're trying to downsize, right? Anyway, I was never good at math. That's okay. That's all right.
Take it to the
fine.
Supreme Court. They'll decide it for you.
Yes. So there's this Jewish doctor who has a patient come in, and the patient's dying, and he's dying of COVID, and the doctor quickly finds out that this guy has tattoos all over his body of Nazi symbols and swastikas and such. And what do you do? What do I do if I was that doctor?
This sounds like a something I might find in one of my Philosophy 101 textbooks, which I love, these kind of ethical dilemmas. Now, I'm guessing this is a true story that you're posing to me.
Yes, and it happened real life in San Francisco about a week and a half ago.
What would I do?
And what would I do?
What would you do?
I'm just thinking about this.
Right.
Yeah.
It's once the real life is there, once you're actually that doctor in that situation where, you're a Jewish doctor, I'm guessing in the details there's more to it, right? There's a nurse who's maybe African American, maybe some other, and a mix of people that are there to save your life. And
right, there's an Asian lung specialist, and it's very diverse team there. Yeah.
And so the patient says, "Save me, I'm dying," and the doctor
says, "Please save me." It's like he seriously wanted to live. I mean, he was like, he was on the edge. What's the term? Something intubation was needed.
Right.
There's all these technical terms, but
what do I do? I mean, in my philosophical state of mind, imagining that I could do this, I'd want to have a conversation. But probably that's like off the table, obviously, when you're trying to treat someone and they're dying and they come into the ER. But it seems like a moment for some reflection. That's merely an ethereal thought. What would I actually do if I was the doctor? I think I would treat the patient. What did the doctor do in this situation?
The doctor treated the patient and felt that it was a hard thing for them to do. They felt a pushback within themselves, but they did treat the patient. Yeah. I've been thinking myself about it, Eric, and I would err on the side of compassion. But if there was wiggle room time, like half hour before the surgery or whatever it is, the intubation, I would want to explore. I don't know if it's so much like, if I find out this, I would not help the patient, but just I would want to reach out and try to understand the level of hatred. Like, would this patient want me to leave the country? Would they want to kill me? Would they want to actively be involved in killing me and my family or something like that? And I think I would try to say, here I am. I'm a generous person. You don't like Jews. That's fine. That's your thing. But I'm making a statement. I am present with you. You can hate me. But we're in this together. We're working on something together. And I just wanted to insert that into this guy's awareness.
Right. Yeah, it makes me kind of think about the potential in some people's worlds that hate is in theory one thing, but when it comes to the reality, like you need other people, then hate certainly in that ER does not hold weight. Right? I mean that I need you, doctor. And whoever that doctor is, he's Jewish, it doesn't matter at all. Is he an intellectual elite, or I'm not jumping to conclusions about who this patient or what he thinks about people that study and then get degrees in order to save other people using their expertise. All of that goes out the door.
Right.
That's interesting.
it goes out the door, and that makes what you just said makes me think that there is that which I would do and there's that which I would want to do, right? I have those two different aspects in my personality. And what I would want to do, I think, is sort of what we just discussed. That's what I would want to do. What I would actually do, it's hard to say. I think if I felt, part of me is very tribal. And if I felt in danger or I felt like my kids were in danger, it's not clear what I would do.
Right. But as the doctor, these doctors, these people on the front lines are certainly being pushed to, their limits. I have no doubt, having to see suffering every day and saving people who are, who are there and suffering and wanting to help them. And so you have someone come in who's clearly wearing on their chest that I don't like your kind. And then they're saying, wait, save me.
Right.
Yeah. What to do?
What to do? And there's, as you pointed out a few minutes ago, there's not a lot of time for the doctor to have philosophical discussions with such patients, as I did a long time ago. I was living in Seattle. Took my car in to get serviced, and the guy was negotiating with me about the price of fixing the engine, and he said, I think I was concerned about a price. He said, don't worry, I'm not going to Jew you. And I said, excuse me, I'm a Jew, and I'm actually a generous person, or at least I'd like to think I am. We had a long discussion. And that was important to me. I don't think I changed his mind. I think he still would make comments like that and believed in things like that. But it was important for me to make a statement, not be so passive as like some kind of victim and let those words just roll over me.
Interesting. Very interesting. It's interesting to think about those two scenarios also, where someone's life is on the line, and in that case where you do have that moment to say, and you can take your business elsewhere, but in that moment you want to make things clear. And did you take his business?
I don't remember.
Oh, doesn't matter. You made your point.
I could make something up. How about that?
Okay.
He ended up painting flowers and Jewish symbols on the hippie van, which it was, and we ended up forming a rock and roll band to rival the Grateful Dead. Not.
So we're here with Dr. Richard Bell. The book is Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. Amazing documenting on your part. I mean, I can't imagine the saga that this has been to make this book, bring this book into the world.
Yeah, I mean, history takes a long time, right? Some people call it a slow history. A colleague of mine calls it, right? To try and do right by these folks takes a long time. So this is the true story, obviously, of 5 free boys kidnapped into slavery from Philadelphia in 1825, and by a gang of human traffickers that specialize in doing this work. One of many dozens of similar gangs doing this awful work, targeting free people, black people, especially children, between the Revolution and the Civil War as a way to profit off their freedom by turning them into illegally seized Southern slaves and selling them at great profit in, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, etc. And I stumbled into this story probably 9 or 10 years ago now. And I was working on a previous book about suicide in American history between the Revolution and the Civil War. I'm clearly drawn to these darker topics. And as I came across the alleged suicide of a 60-year-old white woman in rural Delaware in 1829, 4 years after the events in Stolen, I began to figure out that while she was in jail in Delaware facing death penalty charges for maybe murdering 3 people, that over the previous 20 years, she'd done equally terrible things, that she'd been the co-leader of one of these many different gangs of kidnappers and enslavers. Her name is Patty Cannon, which was at the time not a name known to me, but as you guys know from the book, becomes an increasingly prominent figure in the book itself. And over 20 years as the co-leader of this gang with other members of her family, she and her gang had stolen away from freedom dozens, maybe hundreds of free black people, many of them children, and not just from Philadelphia, but from Maryland, from Delaware, from anywhere within 100 miles of their base, their safe houses out on the Eastern Shore. And I didn't know or expect to find anything like that. I had no idea 10 years ago that the kidnapping of free African Americans into slavery from within the United States, from free soil like Philadelphia, was common. I knew Solomon Northup's story in 12 Years a Slave, but I'd assumed that that was incredibly rare, exceptional. And as you guys know, I've been able to document, so many cases in the course of telling this one particular case, which make it very clear that this happened all the time. And if you open, newspapers in the right place at the right time, you're going to find so many missing persons ads, missing children's ads placed there by members of the free black community in big cities like Philadelphia, Boston, everywhere, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, New York, even Baltimore, which is a slave state with a free black population. So I wrote this book to educate myself about this because I didn't know it, and then to share those findings with as many people as possible. And here we are 9 years later.
Wow. So one of my questions is, since the publication of the book, which I believe was a year ago about?
That's right.
2019. What sorts of reactions have you been getting from Black folks who maybe had ancestors who've gone through this sort of thing, B, boring white middle-class people, and C, maybe white supremacists? I'm just wondering if there's any kind of reaction. I mean, my reaction is, what a profound story this book needs. Not it should be, but it needs to be taught in schools.
So, we could say a few things that, if white supremacists are reading my book, they've not told me that. Let's just say that. And the title may be off-putting for people of that persuasion, because I think the title telegraphs what you're going to get here, right? The title does a lot of work letting you know what the book is about here. And, I think everyone who's come across this story is having, I think, in general, similar reactions to mine, which is, wow, I didn't know this was quite as widespread and awful as it clearly was. As Mark points out, there's a lot of documentation in and around this book in support of this reconstruction. I think, in general, African-American people have a much keener sense than someone like me, and I'm a white male, pretty overprivileged dude, about the various expressions of white supremacy and slavery in American history that have affected African-American communities over generations. So I'm not sure it's as revelatory to some readers as it is to others. But this is certainly not a story that is in the historical mainstream at this point, despite the overwhelming evidence, right? This is actually the first, I think, book-length reconstruction of a case like this outside of the Solomon Northup 12 Years a Slave story, but it won't be the last. There's so much evidence for this. And I called this phenomenon of the kidnapping and trafficking of people, free Black African Americans, into slavery, the reverse Underground Railroad. That term may catch on, it may not, but it's a reminder that the scale of this thing was comparable to the scale of the very different Underground Railroad to freedom.
That's right. And kudos, because I've talked about your book to my kids. And, obviously they say, my younger son, 11-year-old, said, well, what is the reverse Underground Railroad? And I said, well, it was, and thank you for educating me. I couldn't believe that these were boys. When I read it, I kept having to remind myself, these are children that are being taken from their city where they live and taken in a, what was the word, a coffle, is that the word?
That's right.
All the way to Alabama. I mean, it's just astounding trauma, and that they managed to get back, and it leaves me, I don't have, it's so shocking to me. And as you're saying, maybe to other people it's not as shocking. But I guess it's just like, no matter, the more I dive into the American history, as awful as I know as the slave history is, I can always be shocked even deeper, and that's what your book did. Even though I know how terrible it is, and I've read quite a lot and experienced and talked with people a lot, your book definitely was even more of a reminder of what a utterly what a terrible time in the history, and that it continues. I mean, frankly, that's all. I feel like this. I feel like this is not long ago. What you're reporting on is not long ago.
That's right. I mean, I leave readers to find their own resonances with today, but some of the ones that jump out to me, for instance, are what was happening on our southwestern border over the last 3 years, when actually a government agency, not individual citizens acting privately, but a government agency was separating, parents and children from each other and making it impossible to reconnect. I'm also, struck by one of the things which is very apparent to me in Stolen is the fragility of Black freedom on free soil, right? That you can be legally free but still be terrorized in various ways. And of course, I think, many African-American communities today around the country would recognize threats to their freedom and way of life taking different expression, but it's the same root, culture of, for lack of a better word, white supremacy, which persists in America over a long span. And it was interesting, Eric, to hear you talk there about your response to the fact that these are kids. And what you said immediately before that, which was seemingly disconnected, was that you have a son, right? I think you have two sons, in fact, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. I have two daughters, right? Yeah, right. The youngest child in Stolen of the five who is kidnapped is 8 years old. The oldest is 15. All of us who are parents and all of us who are not parents can imagine what those bonds are like and what it means to be severed from your children, your most precious relations, without any hope of getting them back.
Right. Well, I think that really speaks to one of the many powers of your narrative, and that is the ability for people to empathize with the story, which you were just saying. And that is, for me, it's difficult for me to imagine myself as a slave, because ethically and morally, you can sort of think, kidnapping on the one hand, and people who are slaves and they're taken legally back in the 1800s from their parents. It's really, there's an equivalence there. And yet your story is something I can relate to maybe on a deeper level, because I can imagine being a free guy in a city where I've walked, being Philadelphia. So your story, I guess, is more accessible to me, and I could imagine I was one of those 10-year-olds or 15-year-olds.
And let me just build on that, Mark. It's a great observation, and I want to say that anti-slavery activists, both Black and white, who back in the pre-Civil War period were trying to get more and more white middle-class people in the North to give a damn about Southern slavery's persistence south of Pennsylvania, leveraged stories like this one, where free Northerners had their freedom stolen out from under them by kidnappers, as a way to remind Northern comfortable middle-class evangelical readers, for instance, that nowhere is safe in America from slavery, that slavery is like a cancer which gets in every cell of the United States. And if you think you're distant from slavery because you live in Massachusetts or something like that, then why is there a slave catcher in your town next week? Why was there a kidnapper here last week? Nowhere is safe from the tentacles of American slavery. And these stories of parents and children, which are all true, are also turned into very useful fodder in the anti-slavery campaign to get Northern white parents off their couches and to an anti-slavery meeting, to build a mass movement, a moral majority against slavery, which is an uphill struggle because most Northerners really do not think twice about Southern slavery. They know it's there. They'll probably agree it's not great. but are they going to get off their couches and do anything, right? The amount of apathy that has to be overcome to fight American slavery outside the Black community, which has been fighting it from day one, is extraordinary. And so stories like this can help move the needle.
I thought it was really interesting that you point out that some Southerners who would try to say, look, we're fighting against these kidnappers in order to like try to make the South look better. You know, like that we can slice things in that way that like, oh look, we're about justice. We want to get these kidnappers put in jail because they're doing something terrible. And meanwhile, they're, you know, legal slave trade, no problem. Like that is, boy, that is, you know, that's some math for you or whatever. It's just like, that's a calculus that is...
Some moral calculus. Absolutely, Eric. Yeah, right. So both sides, the anti-slavery campaign, which I just referenced, but also what I would call a pro-slavery boosters, people who are defenders of the way of life, as the euphemism goes, of owning slaves in the American South, also see leverage in engaging with kidnappers for exactly the reason Eric just gave, right? That if you can be seen to be acting against kidnappers as a Southern slaveholder, as a Southern political office holder, as a Southern attorney general, then what you're really doing, of course, is insulating the legal domestic slave trade from accusations that it is the same as kidnapping, that at least we're not kidnappers, right? We only deal in legally purchased enslaved people that we bought legally in Maryland, legally transported across the country to Mississippi. Kidnapping and slave trading are not the same. Let me assure you, everyone. I hope you can hear the sarcasm in my voice there, because we all, I think all of us would recognize that slavery is man stealing. Slavery is fundamentally kidnapping, and everything else is just dressing on top of it, right? So this is what anti-slavery activists and free Black people and enslaved people all intuitively understand, but they have to push back against a lot of PR, again, for lack of a better word, put out by slave owners and their boosters to try to inoculate the and defend the legal slave trade on which their livelihoods often depend. So, you know, what does it look like today? I mean, there's cause for both pessimism and optimism, of course, as there is at any point in American history. And the pessimism, of course, is to realize that the racialized crisis that we've lived through these past 2 summers most obviously are not isolated events and incidents. They didn't pop out of nowhere randomly. They're deeply connected to a train of, you know, racialized thinking and racialized abuses, which have been going back to 1619 and beforehand, right? And I have a British accent, and Britain and its empire are deeply complicit in everything involved in slavery and in the slave trade and its prosecution over that period. But in America, of course, we saw, you know, tools of racial oppression, you know, perfected almost in the period before the Civil War. And racism and white supremacy did not suddenly vanish because Lincoln signed a document in 1863 called the Emancipation Proclamation, or the 15th Amendment later on, after Lincoln's dead. So, you know, we can, I think too often, those of us without sufficient historical context, I think, pat ourselves on the back in this country of ours that we abolished slavery and therefore we've been the good guys ever since, which I think is a pretty superficial reading of American history. When you look at Jim Crow, when you look at segregation, separate but equal, with everything that provoked the civil rights campaigns of the 1950s and 1960s. They're not doing it for fun. They're doing it for their survival, right? That's in the 1950s and 1960s and onwards still. If we look at the war on drugs, if we look at mass incarceration, these are different manifestations of the same root, you know, beliefs and attitudes about white superiority, right? And African-American subjugation. So I'm always interested in getting my students to draw those connections between the way we live now and the way we were, and to see that you know, America is the product of American history. So these problems are deeply entrenched, I guess, which is what the pessimist in me would want to constantly remind people. The optimist in me says that Americans of one stripe or another have always marshaled, oftentimes in very small, modest numbers, against these overwhelming injustices and rallied to try to bring as many other Americans with them on a campaign to make this a more perfect union. And I think that we could point to various victories and accomplishments and milestones, none of which are perfect or complete, but all of which are a reminder that there are loads of good people in this country who, when they learn about injustice, engage with those issues. And we've seen that most visibly in the Black Lives Matter movement, which is an enormously important event in American history. And I want to say one more quick thing, and I have apologies for rambling on here, Mark, that while the fight against racial injustice is continuing, so too actually is the fight against slavery and human trafficking. It's not racialized in quite the same way since 1865, but slavery and human trafficking continue apace. Today, there are more slaves in the world today in 2020 than there were in 1850. Slaves are much cheaper to buy in 2020 than they were ever in 1850. This is all illegal. It's all black market, and yet it goes on under our noses. So I'm so glad that there are heroes around the world in groups like Free the Slaves, Anti-Slavery International, Polaris, which are mounting their own modern anti-slavery campaigns. And the least we could do is visit their websites and learn more about this issue and donate to them regularly and get involved and go to a meeting, right? We all like to think that if we were alive in the pre-Civil War period, we'd be one of the abolitionists. I think we all tell ourselves that. Well, we've got a choice to make, right? Every day we get up in 2020, right? Which side of history do we want to be on? What actions are we taking as regards racial injustice? What actions are we taking regarding modern day human trafficking and slavery? So there's always a choice to be made.
I understand much more deeply now after reading your book that once the Atlantic slave trade was stopped, remind me the year.
1808.
1808, then that only accelerated slave trade within the country. I mean, that makes perfect sense, but I don't think I had quite understood that. And now I was like, oh, of course. It only just made it,
It opened up the market because the Deep South wanted slaves. Where were they going to get them?
That's right. Yeah. So I think I teach undergraduates at the University of Maryland, and to them, 1808 is a date with no meaning. They've never heard that date before. It doesn't ring a bell with them. But among historians, I think it's a pretty well-known date. But it's not the transformative date like 1865, the end of the Civil War, 13th Amendment, or 1863, Emancipation Proclamation, right? Because it didn't. The ending of legal importations of black people from overseas for the purposes of enslaving in America did not bring slavery to an end in America in 1808, right? Slavery doesn't die in 1809, in 1810. In fact, as we just remarked, slavery in the United States will grow and thrive. The number of enslaved people on the eve of the Civil War in 1860 is far greater than the number of enslaved people in the Union in 1808 when America refuses to no longer legally participate in transatlantic slavery. There's still smuggling, by the way, afterwards. There's all this kidnapping of free people that I describe within the United States in stolen. But mostly the driver of growth, of course, is natural reproduction. It's enslaved women having kids. And one of the most evil things about slavery, and it's hard to choose, is the fact that it's hereditary. It passes through the mother's womb, right? Any child born to an enslaved mother is, by definition, enslaved. So slavery grows and thrives as a result of that. The siphoning off of legal imports is not even remotely sufficient to put a dent in slavery's growth over the next 50 years.
Particularly as the, what was it called, Manifest Destiny, as the pioneers and the people taking hold of the United States. Of course, there were people already here, but as they moved west and expanded their land grab, if you will.
Yeah, there certainly were people here, of course, right? Massive numbers of Native Americans who are forcibly removed, put on reservations, ethnically cleansed by various presidential and state-level administrations. But Andrew Jackson is the poster boy for ethnic cleansing and campaigns against Native Americans. And it's an abomination. He is on our money and in our banknotes and in our wallets every day. When you could put Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass or any number of 100 more worthy Americans on the banknotes we carry around in our pockets every day. That's a hobby horse. But yes, absolutely right. One other context here is the context Mark's raised, which is that the amount of U.S. territory which is being turned over to cash crop agriculture is dramatically expanding over exactly the same period, which is to say in the most fertile regions in the Deep South, where they've understood that cotton can grow and thrive and that cotton can be immensely profitable, they decide that, white farmers and settlers decide that they're not going to pick on themselves. They're going to enslave African Americans to do so. So they need to acquire more and more African Americans. So they engage in smuggling. They engage in kidnapping of free black people. And of course, they're willing to buy, often at rapidly increasing prices, enslaved people already in the United States on plantations in Eric and I's neck of the woods in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, who plantation owners might be willing to sell some of their enslaved workers if they can get a significant profit from them, and have a legal slave trader legally transport them, an enslaved person, from Maryland to Mississippi. This is called the domestic slave trade. It's sadly not as well known as the transatlantic slave trade, but it should be. It was massive. We're talking more than 1 million people forcibly transported, wholly legally, from our region down to the deep South. My late great colleague at the University of Maryland, Professor Ira Berlin, dubbed that migration the second Middle Passage, to remind people that the domestic slave trade is of a similar scale to the transatlantic slave trade, and ruins lives and destroys black families in the same ways that the transatlantic slave trade did, all to fuel the sort of growth and manifest destiny of the United States that Mark was referring to.
Fascinating. So one of the things is fascinating to me are cultural differences between countries. I'm curious how your story is being received in the UK versus in the United States.
Yeah, so I have limited data on that because despite this British accent, I no longer live there. My family definitely do, and we've been in close contact, but my family can only buy so many copies, if you see what I mean. So I was on a podcast in the UK recently with the great writer and cultural commentator Mark Hayward. The podcast is called Behind the Spine. It's about the craft of writing. And it was interesting to see that he's, a clever, well-read guy. It was interesting to sort of figure out that as a non-American, someone who didn't live and breathe U.S. history and culture all the time, that there were things he knew about American history and things he didn't know about American history, in the same way that if you and I were asked about French history, there'd be things we know and things we definitely didn't know. At least that's true for me. So it's hard to know how this fits into pre-existing knowledge outside of the United States. We've already said that I think for many Americans in the United States, some of this comes as a revelation. So I think that's even more so for people beyond the United States. But it is a more general point, Mark. Britain has only recently started to confront its own role and complicity and responsibility for the terrible things that came along with what's known as the British Empire, right? And the transatlantic slave trade is a massive part of that legacy. Racial injustice, exclusion, or white supremacy are another massive part and related part of that legacy. But when I was in school in Britain in the 1980s, we didn't study the British Empire because we knew it was a bit embarrassing, but we couldn't really say why. And now I hope, 20 years later, if my children were growing up in school over there now, I think they probably would study the slave trade, and they would study Britain's role in the slave trade, which is to say they're starting to face this difficult past. And it's hard work, right? No one likes to be told that the country they're so proud of has so much blood on its hands. Right. So it's often easier just to think about when times when there were unalloyed things to cheer about. So when I was in school, Mark, we studied World War II all the time. Why? Because in a British mindset, we fought the Nazis and we won single-handedly. Good versus evil. No Americans or Russians involved, by the way. Good versus evil, right? We were the good guys. So the British Empire is a much more conflicted story. Likewise in America too. I get the sense that our students in K-12 environments still do a lot with the civil rights era and Martin Luther King and what an important, heroic figure he is, but we don't always perhaps figure out why he has to devote his life to fighting for the most basic civil rights, right? That's a story too, and it belongs alongside the civil rights victories of that era.
Well, thank you for shining a light on such an important subject in such a powerful, heartfelt, and approachable way.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, the book is Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery in Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. Really an important, such an important piece of literature and history, and I'm so grateful it came into both of our worlds. And thank you for all the work you did to make it happen.
Thank you so much. This has been a labor of love. I think it's important. I really appreciate the platform to talk about this important piece of American history. You guys stay well and stay safe.
Mark, you come up with great ideas for songs, and you suggested "Oh Freedom" for this 8th episode, which I think is a wonderful idea. It's one of my favorite songs of all time, and I know you feel the same. You love that song, and I didn't know this song till I was working at a charter school in Washington, D.C., and as a teacher, which kind of shocks me now. But the first time I heard that song, I said, "What is that song?" And I heard the kids singing it. And, since then, I've sung it a lot. I've thought about it a lot and its meaning. I sang it to my son, Leo, the day he was born, and I sang it to him like every day. Every night I would sing him that song. And when he was 2 years old, I got a recording of him singing "Oh Freedom," which I'm going to play now, which we followed on this recording by my group Jawbone, who's Michaela and Greg Heelan, with Matt Jones on the piano, and we sang "Oh Freedom." And we also then, that same group, Michaela and Greg and I, Jawbone, we sang it at Leo's bar mitzvah when he was 13. And listening to it really made me think about the power of the song and the power of teaching our kids to not hate, to love, and also to think about the meaning of a song like that and where that song comes from.
Oh, freedom, oh, mommy, I did. I am a cave. My home, your wife.
It's a song I carry with me in my heart, and the harmony is and the meaning, and it just takes me back in time to emotionally to difficult times. And it's a song that gives one strength. Maybe there's a civil war going on. Maybe there's a family war going on. Maybe there's a breakup, a divorce, someone got shot, someone died. It's just, it's a centering song, a song for somebody to get back to one's grounding with the earth and to oneself, one's deepest elements.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful. It strikes me, I'd love to know where the song came from, where it, I know where it comes from, and that's what's so powerful about it. It is definitely comes out of years and years and years of suffering, a lot of suffering, and refusal to suffer anymore. It's almost like it carries, it carries that emotion through the years.
It somehow carries hope and sadness at the same time for me.
Right. Right.
It's a song baked and born in suffering.
Okay, so when the word frivolous is used to describe what Mr. Peach is doing, is that also part of the prank?
Yes. It's like no frivels. Like at a party you have the frivels. Do you ever get the frivels?
Yeah, with beer.
Yeah. Oh my God. I like the little nose quiver sensation. I actually kind of like that. Especially cold beer.
Cold beer and warm frivels.
Oh my God. It's like the perfect. It's almost like the snake going back to its tail.
Yes.
And dialing collect.
Does it stick its tail through the frivels?
Oh
kind of like eating Cheerios off your finger or something. I don't know.
Yeah, if you have like really small fingers, you can do that. Yeah. Go finger.
Yeah. Well, once the snake starts eating the Cheerios, it's I think all bets are off.
Oh my God, that's absolutely crunchy.
Like Vermont crunchy, like hacky sack crunchy.
Yes. The problem with Vermont is that we've all left. We've gone to a different state. Like you look around, the governor, God bless the governor, but the governor has so many stringent measures about this COVID. Which is correct.
I'm sorry,
He's doing the right thing. But there's no one here because everyone's gone to South Dakota because everyone wants to party.
And that South Dakota is definitely the place to party.
My gosh.
If you're looking for a party.
Pull up your Harley and let's Sturgis,
why do you think they have 4 senators in the Dakotas? It's a party town. As in, by town, I mean 2 states.
Could you write that down and email it to me? I'm going to need to study that a bit. It's a little bit like the snake. What is that metaphor of the snake sort of going around to itself? It's like a creature that eats itself. Is that what's happening in America?
By America, do you mean a certain party, or just I don't mean the party that's in the Dakotas. I mean like a political party, or are you saying the entire kit and caboodle?
All I'm saying is that Rudy Giuliani, there's no way that that's Rudy.
I'll come back to that, will you? I'm starting to suspect this is actually not about Rudy or Peach, and it's all about you.
Do you know the Beatles sang about this? They foreshadowed it. You know the song that goes, "Get back, get back, get back to where you once." That's what they're talking about. Getting back to the discussion about Rudy Giuliani being actually Mr. Peach, because no former New York City mayor in their right mind would have done those 5 pillars of Zen.
You gotta be careful singing that Beatles song just like willy-nilly, you know. YouTube's gonna like put a strike on you for copyright infringement before Mr. Peach can get to you with the with the fuzz.
Well, speaking of the fuzz, tell me if this is right or wrong. Well, is it?
Wrong.
Okay, well then I can continue.
Good.
So Mr. Peach recently bought up some huge corporations, the biggest in the world.
Oh.
And then he started, I don't know, doing whatever you do when you have all these corporations. Well, it turns out that they're now breaking up Mr. Peach into different pies.
Oh no.
Peach pies.
Oh.
One is called WhatsApp. Another's called Little Eensy Weensy Mark Zuckerweenie. And the other is called Insta.
Insta.
Yeah. It weighs a gram.
That's not a lot.
No, it's not a lot. And the thing is, it all has to do with power, because Mr. Peach, in doing his prank, is really showing that he's giving the finger to power out there, because he's thinking there's all these sad things, but I'm still going to have a good time, and I'm going to show power that that I'm not going to be bowled over by it. He's not shaking in his boots.
Yeah, he's just farting in the courthouse in front of Jen.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot that one. That was one of the 6 pillars of Zen.
Farting in the courthouse.
Farting in the courthouse with
it wasn't
Rudy.
a court, actually. I strike that. It was
that, Your Honor.
In the what was it, in the Capitol building? Is that one of the pillars of Zen? Is the fart in the
Isn't that why they got
state
these
capitol?
big domes so you can sort of walk around and not like pass out?
That is why they build those big domes.
And they've got the little nozzle way at the top of the dome, so the nipple, if you will. And if you spin that around counterclockwise, my friend, then everybody can continue their conversation.
Does the nozzle like open and shut?
It does. Yeah.
Really?
Just like in Monty Python. Yeah. Exactly. Good thing we've got Mitch McConnell to kind of hold everything together and provide a moral framework for our nation.